Thomas Aquinas actually uses Aristotle's proofs for the existence of God. Remember, Aristotle's God he's proving is not the God of the Bible, but the arguments work very well. The first way, these first three come from what's called the cosmological argument. From motion. This is the concept of inertia. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. Objects in motion tend to be in motion. Okay. Unless they're met by an object of equal or greater force. So if you see me up here moving around, you have to ask yourself, why is Fred moving around? And you would say, someone put Fred into motion, which would be my parents. And then it begs the question, who put my parents into motion? If you were raised good Baptist fundamentalists like me, my parents took me all the way back to Adam and Eve, which I was still fine with. I was even fine with Adam coming from the dust of the ground, because I still have that. It's tied into this cause and effect. Every cause has an efficient effect, something that brought it into existence. But then it gets disturbing, right? Because then when I ask where Adam came from, they said God. Still no problem. But when I asked where did God come from, they said God didn't come from nowhere. He has always existed. And that melted my little mind, because it was breaking the rules now. But this is exactly what Aristotle was pointing at. You cannot there has to be a first cause or a first mover, like the original domino flicker that set the whole cosmos into order. And that is how he described God. God is the uncaused cause. He caused every other thing to happen, but nothing causes him to happen except himself. And he's the unmoved mover. Nothing can move God, but God moves or puts into motion everything else. You can see how easily you could adapt these into a Christian proof for the existence of God from necessary being. And these two are kind of tied in together. This idea of contingency. God is the only being or substance in the universe that is self-caused. Everything else is contingent and dependent. In other words, everything you see in this room is dependent on something else for its existence, including ourselves. If we stopped eating, if we stopped having sunshine or water or air, we would perish. God is not dependent on anything for his existence or his continuance, where we are dependent on both for existence and continuance. The ontological argument was actually developed by St. Anselm, who came slightly before Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is 13th century. And Anselm developed what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. And it's my personal favorite. Most evangelicals, they hate this one. But I think it's because it's so cerebral and philosophical. I just don't think a lot of people understand it. But once you understand it, you see the beauty. Because these other proofs are dependent upon empiricism, where you go out and you see a physical material world and you come up with a narrative or a story about it. The ontological argument, you don't have to go anywhere except in your own head. And that's why I like it. So here's how it goes. Anselm defines God as that of which nothing greater than can be conceived. Okay, one more time. God is that of which nothing greater than can be conceived. And you might say, Blackburn, I can think of something bigger than God. Well, then that is God. Okay. So you can't get out of his definition, because whatever your greatest, highest thought is, that is God. Then he pivots from that of which nothing greater than can be conceived. So sorry. Got a mess on my board. From this, he is actually doing a meditation from the passage in Scripture that says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. He's pointing out why the person is a fool. Because as soon as you say the word God, you're acknowledging the existence of such a being, that of which nothing greater than can be conceived. Now, one of his contemporaries said, that's so stupid, Aquinas. I can think of all sorts of fantastical things that don't exist, like an ice cream sundae the size of an island, that of which no greater ice cream sundae could exist. Therefore, it must exist. But see, the difference between God and ice cream sundaes, we can think of imaginary ice cream sundaes. But see, if you think of an imaginary God, and then you think of a real God, which one is greater? The real one. Therefore, the real God exists. It creates like a mental loop. So play with that in your head for a while and see if that works for you. The other thing has to do with hierarchies, the great chain of being. If I say, when I go to people's house, I always ask them, they'll offer me coffee and I'll say, is it real coffee? I'm being Neoplatonic on them. Obviously, it's going to be a real dark beverage in my mug. But what I'm really asking is, was this handpicked by maidens singing in the moonlight to the coffee plants and ground with love and steeped in sacred spring waters? Or is this Folgers flavor crystals that you're going to put in hot water? So in my mind, I have a hierarchy of real and fake coffee. Aquinas and Aristotle are saying, where did that come from? How can you do that? Why do you have these hierarchies? It's because, back to the great chain of being, you see the influence. We already have this idea. If I talk about something being good or beautiful or true, it's because there's a template already existing in my head that's making those value judgments. And I don't care if you're an atheist, a Buddhist, or a fundamentalist. We all have these templates and these hierarchies. And the fifth way, this is probably the one you're most familiar with, the teleological argument, which comes from the Greek teleos, which means design or purpose. And you've probably heard preachers use the analogy of, if a tornado went through a junkyard, would you expect to find a brand new 54 Chrysler constructed from the chaos? And you would say, well, no. But the idea is, if we look into nature, if we see a nautilus shell or a spiral Fibonacci galaxy or the harmony of the spheres or the human footprint or the geometry of a wildflower, it implies or infers a designer. So design implies designer. It's an inference. And that's the one probably most evangelicals are familiar with. So the cause and effect, cosmological, the argument from being, who God is, the necessity of his being, and then through design or purpose. And he begins to open the door out of the medieval period, because in the medieval period, it's the age of faith, right? But he said, if we're made in the image of God, God is the most rational being in the universe. So that means humans must also have reason. And I'm out of time, but this will be a good place to start our next class, talking about Aquinas' faith and reason and how it opens the door to the Renaissance, which means rebirth, and then to what we'll call modern philosophy. So I'll get a running start with Aquinas next class, and then we'll do modern philosophy.